Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode. Today, we have a very special guest. We have Arun Ghosh, who is with KPMG. He is the U.S. blockchain leader for innovation in the United States. And, we're going to be talking through a lot of different aspects, ranging from how emerging technologies are used to solve real problems in the pharmaceutical industry, technologies like blockchain, AI, IoT, and many, many others. So I don't want to do disjustice to my guest here. I want to maybe start off with Arun. Would you mind giving us an introduction to who you are and what your role at KPMG is?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me. This is, long time coming. So I appreciate you taking the time and scheduling this, despite the 50 other approvals we all need in getting this done. But yeah, so we've been at blockchain for some time, but the genesis of blockchain KPMG started about 18 months ago or so, when the firm took a step back and said, how do we not only integrate our efforts, but also, most importantly, create a cohesive strategy between our audit, tax, and advisory business. And it's one of those things where, you raise your hand and you end up being voluntold. And so as things progressed, I raised my hand and then I was voluntold. But beyond that, but in consulting, 24 years, that actually dates me. But beyond that, it's been a fun ride. And at KPMG, we're focused on three things today: crypto, climate, COVID. And happy to go into each of those as we go along.
Yeah, that's really cool. So, tell me a little bit more about, what maybe one of your passion projects.
How much time do we have? But anyway,
For you,
so I
as
think
much time as you want.
oh, aren't you the kindest? Where's the champagne? All right. So I think the big one is climate, right? As we've seen, all of us take a big pause from traveling, from consuming, different services and different products, and mostly work from home. And especially you and I, as knowledge workers, that's still okay. But in the non-knowledge worker economy, it's harder. But it's also given us a good view on what is broadly known as ESG, so enterprise governance sustainability. And the last, I'd say, a year or so, when we started looking at blockchain, more than blockchain, we saw a convergence play, and climate and carbon capture became a natural fit for enhancing not just a trusted data behind carbon capture, but also the ability to report, the ability to be transparent, the ability to realize corporate responsibility. And since then, we've just been not just busy, we've just been drawn into so many strategic conversations, but also in a post-COVID economy, in what we're calling at KPMG the new reality. How do you bring sustained and planned investments to achieve each of those goals? So that's I'm very passionate about it. We're very busy, which is good in this in this economy, but also it's driving significant change. And just a quick shout out to Microsoft and Satya and his vision has been spectacular, sort of in aspirations for us to go achieve, but more importantly, laying out that groundwork for someone like for him and the corporation has been hugely powerful for us.
Yeah, it has, and as a Microsoft employee, it makes me, really proud to not only think of this as, hey, we're going to solve this, from now going forward, but also from the existence of our company to go back to that point and say, hey, we're going to retroactively address all these issues that we've created in the climate. That's it's phenomenal. You couldn't ask for a better leader. And just seeing with all this COVID changes, seeing jellyfish, reemerge in dolphins in Venice,
Right?
Italy, in the canals. I mean,
Yeah.
it's crazy how much change we can affect in a very short period of time with relatively simple things that we can do. By just saying, hey, everyone stay home for a little while. the environment self corrects, and it's fascinating. So I share a lot of your passion. I've got 3 kids under the age of 12, and so it keeps me up at night making sure that they have a safe place to live once I'm gone or in a retirement home going insane. So speaking
Yeah.
of retirement homes and all that great stuff, drugs, pharmaceuticals. You've done a lot of work to really help out the medical community, the pharmaceutical industry, and just recently you announced with IBM and a few other companies. Walmart was included in that, a FDA
Right.
pilot. And
Hmm.
for those that aren't familiar with that FDA pilot, it's essentially and I'm probably going to botch this, and you're going to say, Mike, you're all wrong, but I'm going to give it a shot. But essentially, it's a reg that essentially allows us to create an interoperable platform to
Hmm.
electronically track and trace, identify prescription medicine, and to combat the issues that many in the industry know about around fraudulent drugs being sold, created, etc. in the supply chain, theft, lots and lots of issues. So
Hmm.
you know, maybe give us an understanding of, from your perspective, you've been in the bowels of all this. For that FDA pilot, what did that consist of? Why did you guys build this pilot? Was there a specific impetus? Was there a law or regulation that was forcing your hand down that route?
Yeah, no. So that's a it's been a journey with that whole process, and it started, a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. No, I'm just kidding. But in the fall of 2017, we were approached by Mark to examine the ability and the transferability of blockchain into the enterprise space. It was still early. There was a lot of organizations going after 2 or 3 different protocols. As I like to explain to people I speak to all the time, everybody hears of Ethereum, everybody hears of Hyperledger, and I said, look, I think if you dial back 20 years, and I'm dating myself here, is in the old age of videotapes, you had, Sony had Betamax, and then you had VHS.
Yep.
It's no different. They both play video, right? And so from that concept, it's the same process in taking each of those protocols and saying, if I'm going to create supply chain transparency, if I'm going to prevent counterfeit products, how do I bring an append-only cryptographic mechanism of capturing data? And for those who are listening, cryptographic key essentially is more than just bit encryption, right? It's essentially you're inheriting keys from the previous block, hence blockchain. And so we started examining what that strategy would be, and more so how do we realize business value? Because technology is only as real as it adds the value story, in terms of driving transparency, but most importantly, revenue, most or process efficiency. And to us, it became an efficiency play in terms of not just creating transparency between the manufacturer, the distributor, and the dispenser, but also creating that ecosystem and network. So it's still, a lot of sort of counter arguments are, these networks are already set up. Why do you need blockchain? Well, they're set up, but that's why you also have bad actors, because the setup doesn't actually work. If you did have the setup that worked flawlessly, well, nothing else works flawlessly except Domino's. Shout out to my favorite pizza joint. But 30 minutes or less. But long story short, I think that level of introspection was required for the industry. And since 2017, we built the capability, we built the journey in terms of the value story. And we were fortunate enough to bring Walmart to the ecosystem as well, in collaborating and creating this capability. Because if you don't have that coalition of the willing, none of these programs will work, right? It's fundamentally disruptive. And what we found very interesting about these participants, that they were willing to disrupt themselves rather than get disrupted. And that is the fundamental sort of spark that drives innovative agendas in the enterprise. because it's not just driving for the enterprise, but the ecosystem that the enterprise manages and controls. And so it's been that journey. It's been hard, mostly because of the issues on who's sharing what data, where does what go, how often. But one thing I will add before I finish my monologue here is the ability to recall, right? And what we've identified with the FDA's guidance is to not only dispense product one way, but to, if you were to initiate a recall process within the drug supply chain, you could now do that with the proof of where the data is, proof of where product is. The product and data are synonymous to each other now in this massively opaque supply chain. And so that to us became a very powerful aha moment as we concluded the pilot.
Yeah. So, what's curious about what you had said, and I wholeheartedly agree with it. You'd mentioned the coalition of the willing, and you know the willing part of the coalitions are easy as long as you have the willing. So,
Right.
for that pilot, what were some of the drivers to get people involved, to get people at the table?
I think, the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, the DSCSA regulation was a definite driver. But there was also this innate passion, if I can say that, of the individuals we worked with to say it was never a question about why blockchain or why AI and blockchain. It was the question of why not. And if we were to go do that, and it was so refreshing for us because half the time the dialogue is about why disrupt ourselves when everything works the way it is. And I tell my team, and I'll say it now, is that if we always did what we always do, somebody else is doing it better,
Yeah.
right? And that was the core principle of how we all brought ourselves to bear and said, look, there is not just a good way, there's a better way. And I don't know if you've watched The Mandalorian on Disney, but now it's
Of
become this is
course.
the way. This is the way.
No, absolutely. And so, with bringing these folks together, the pilot's over, right?
Hmm. It
What
is. It
what,
is.
what
We just published a report in February, right before COVID. Yeah.
so what were some of the key outcomes that you were able to report out of that as saying, hey, this is why you want to use these technologies, this is why you need to have the coalition of the willing to participate in a network like this. What were some of those outcomes?
So I'd go with the three big outcomes and then maybe one challenge, which everybody continues to face, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I think the big takeaway was enterprise blockchain is here in the sense that it's no longer a concept. It's no The proof of concept was 2016, right? And 17. Now it's time to, graduate, and not just graduate college, but go to grad school because, as folks, the wonderful folks at Azure Engineering have been able to sort of help develop the creative side of bringing platform as a service components, right, without getting too technical.
Yeah,
What
so
that
so
means
so
is that I
Arun,
can,
so there was another shout out there. So two of your
yeah,
favorite places where you love to eat pizza and where you love to be cloudy. So
there we go.
I'm loving the shout
Exactly.
outs here.
And that's it. Yeah, at some point, you have to underscore that Arun Ghosh wasn't sponsored in any shape or form by Microsoft or Domino's.
Right.
But I think the three key takeaways to your question was blockchain works, blockchain is scalable, and blockchain is cheap.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is there's this big myth around, oh my God, I'm going to set up a blockchain node. It's going to take me 15 days and 500 people. Not so. It's same like setting up a big data Hadoop node, 3 minutes or less. In
Yep.
fact, better than Domino's. And not just that, it's the question is not what it is, the question is what do you want to do with it, right? And so what we found increasingly over time is there is not just the recognition, but also the whole construct of the decentralized web or Web 3.0, as you and I know it, is just synonymous to the cloud infrastructure now. It doesn't matter, right? And it's there. You deploy it. The question is again, what are the outputs? And so one big output, like I mentioned, was the recall functionality, but also that the harder part is not just the data sharing. The harder part is to make the governance work. What I mean by that is the continuous monitoring of the solution on the network. right? And we as KPMG are the independent objective arbiter of any such kind of system. So for us, it becomes a fairly, I wouldn't say simple. Nothing is simple, but it's very easy to transfer something we do in governance frameworks to bring to pharmaceutical supply chain network like we did.
No, it makes total sense. And, what I like about what you said is the technology part's easy. And, yeah, outside of trying to roll your own on a server under your desk and, having to deal with all the infrastructure and all that in the modern era of, moving to the cloud and, all that hosted there and managed there, it's fairly straightforward. The hardest part is really the business side of all this. You
Right.
are actively re-architecting your B2B relationships. So these
Mm-hmm.
business to business relationships, yeah, in this whole blockchain world, you've got these smart contracts. Well,
Mm-hmm.
you're essentially reestablishing, the terms and conditions between two companies. It may
Mm-hmm.
be a revisiting of an existing agreement, a new agreement,
Mm-hmm.
but either
Mm-hmm.
way, it requires business leaders to be on board. It requires the lawyers to agree, which, as we know, is can be
Mm-hmm.
challenging. Can be challenging. Um, but also, we have to make sure that we're able to bring together. Again, we're going to go back to that pithy statement that you made earlier: the coalition of the willing. Now, in technology, usually we only have to deal with trying to sell our own company on an idea. Now we've got to
Mm-hmm.
sell one, two, three, 10, 50, 100, and they're all bringing their business people, their lawyers, their finance people, etc. And so that's what makes this
Mm-hmm.
tricky, and that's really the part that gets drawn out. And the sad reality is that we spend a lot of time focusing on the technology where that's not as important as getting the business model right, getting the governance model right, getting the data model and the information architecture right.
Right.
Those are some of the
Mm-hmm.
key challenges that I've seen as well.
Absolutely. And it takes, again, remember back to your set of examples of making this work in a multi-party system, the mandate has to come from the top, right? So what we realized with each of these organizations is there's this not just desire to adopt and adapt, but also if they didn't, somebody would eat their lunch. Again, going back
Yeah,
to that example. And so when you have such significant leadership top-down mandate that is willing to, again, not just explore, but understand the next new normal, if I can say that. And this was all pre-COVID, remember, right? And the pilot we did and the work we did were all vaccines. So it just holds true or rings true in so many ways today that all of us, as we look back on the journey we tread, uh, we can't imagine that how much our experience and the work we've done rings true and rings life now as COVID becomes the new normal.
yeah, and so we'll jump to that here in just a moment. I guess the last question about the pilot,
Hmm.
if you had to rewind and start the project over, what were some of the lessons that you learned that you might, do things differently the next time around?
Um, so again, the process and the journey was always the good part, right? We always had a unified vision of what we wanted to achieve. And then the FDA came along and announced its pilot program, so it all became integrated. But if you were to do something, different or better, knowing what we know now, I think that the two or three things that come to mind is the we we circulated around, what product line, how much time to spend on which parts, and those are not easy decisions to make. But as organizations, again, think about the new normal, there's a better, more accelerated path to get there. That's one. The second thing is collaboration. So I think everybody collaborated, everybody wanted to do more. And if we could find and had the luxury of time, Mike, to bring more participants, we would have loved to do that.
Right.
Because it only enriches the experience, only enriches the output, right? So more than vaccines, we could have done it for inhalers or any prescription product that you can imagine, right? And run those in a multiple node environment across more than the participants. And then the last thing that I would come to mind is the we tried to explore using mobile technology for a patient angle, but given the timeline, the approvals to get to the patient, because that is the true north of this solution.
Right.
It is patient safety. It's product safety, but why? For patient safety, right? And so if you can put the technology in the hands of the patient, that once they walk up to their pharmacy pickup window and they pick up the prescription and they can QR code it on their phone, they get the entire genealogy of when it was made, which plant, how many days it was traveling. Think of it as your FedEx barcode, but for your drugs.
Yeah, it's your
And
drug passport.
exactly. And so it's a fundamental shift in thinking, not just for, I think, the pharma and the pharmacy world. It's also a significant shift in healthcare
Yeah.
and how healthcare is delivered, and that is a whole other conversation. Post 5 o'clock with a martini with you. But yes.
Yeah, we should have, since it is past five, we should have had a martini or a bourbon or something here as we do this. But so, and this goes along the theme of what you had mentioned earlier, that the technology isn't the hard part. I mean, I can
Mhm.
remember back, and this is dating me now, back 1999, I want to say, Sun One
Oh.
Conference in San
Hmm.
Francisco, when that was a thing, and we had the government of, I want to say it was Guam, or
Oh. Okay.
and they had implemented smart card technology where they gave every citizen, essentially it was like a driver's license. It
Hmm.
had a smart chip on it, and any hospital you go to, it would be able to pull
Hmm.
up your medical records,
Hmm.
drugs, treatments, all that stuff. It
Yep.
didn't matter. It was completely ubiquitous. Even if you were homeless, you could still go into any clinic or doctor or what have you. And it's
Right.
just amazing how long it's taken us. But I think, and this kind of transitioning into the next area here around COVID. And, we are now living in that next normal because we keep talking about
Hmm.
the new normal. Well, it's now the new normal. Um, that there was a strong push to be able to have a very dynamic supply chain, an adaptive supply chain, a smart supply chain. You can put any pithy buzzword in front of supply chain and it would fit. um, I guess in my mind it's you know how has COVID impacted the pharmaceutical industry? And I'm not talking about specific companies. I don't want you to get into that detail if unless there are things that you can share. But in general, from an industry perspective, has there been a impetus to accelerate these types of efforts that you did with the FDA pilot?
100%, even 1,000%. And there's a cartoon. I'll send it to you later if you want to share it with your community. It's by Tom Fishburne, and there's a group of executives sitting in a office that says, "We don't need digital transformation," and then you have a whole wrecking ball coming from the outside that says COVID-19.
Oh yeah, I saw that.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And so what has happened? We have seen unreal collaborations, and especially with vaccines, especially with drugs, especially with the three combinations that are helping either flatten the curve or manage the curve. One is obviously better good supply of PPE, but the other one is the drug cocktail combination, whether it's hydrochloroquine, antiretrovirals, so on and so forth. That's just the second part of it, which is that is the control phase, and the cure phase is still being explored. Right? There's almost a dozen or more vaccines in play, but there are also large groups of companies that are coming together to create this not just nobody's focused on intellectual capital as much as the outcome of patient cure or recovery, so to speak.
Right.
And so that level of unprecedented cross-border sort of collaboration didn't exist, and it has become, going back to the whole age-old proverb of, necessity is the mother of invention.
Right.
It comes back full circle, and we've seen this in many organizations, and we're seeing this in not just in vaccines, but also how can delivery systems get there faster, quicker, cheaper. And so that's one significant observation I would say. The other one, there's this introspection going on because if you look at the source and the supply chain, there's a lot of centralization, right?
Yeah.
In certain parts of the world. Let's just leave it that way, to be politically correct.
Hmm.
And so, if you look at active pharmaceutical ingredient (API), it's also made in two or three large regions. And so there's a lot of introspection going on saying, if you were to step back and detangle and create self-sufficiency that is a little more near shore, how does one go about doing that? Because the economics of it is very hard. And beyond the economics of it, I think there is now will to not to explore that, but also within the construct of the new U.S. Mexico Canada deal that has replaced NAFTA, there's a large amount of investment and interest, I would say, in exploring that transference of capability into a closed loop supply chain rather than a decentralized, fragmented supply chain. And lastly, I would say, just to tee this up, is the integrated healthcare, if I can say that. It's like not just pharmaceuticals driving to a certain outcome or medical technology, but it's the combination of that. So everybody sort of realized that medical devices, drug development, sourcing of core product that goes into the drug, and then the delivery of the systems within the hospitals or large hospital systems that are driving some of the clinical trials is everybody has an equal, if not larger role. The last thing again, I meant that to be the last thing, but I have several last things. I would say the testing, right? The testing
Yeah.
process for whether nucleic testing, whether you have COVID or not, or the antibodies, the antigens, whether monoclonal or IgG. The approach is still out there, but the level of the fever pitch of how this is being expedited is unreal. So that's what we're seeing. That's what is a lot of news outlets are reporting, but it's actually happening in more ways than one, where people are just beyond sending emails. They're picking up the phone and in Zoom calls day and night trying to figure this out.
Right. 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 Yeah. And really, what I heard you say, and just kind of recap this into maybe three salient points is, one, being able to create simulation models on the supply chain to understand where there are potential breakpoints, to be able to do, proactive measures to rectify potential issues downstream, but also to have a rapid response capability. Because if we can't
Exactly.
see our supply chain, we can't respond to our supply chain. And so I'm
Correct.
hearing, that is a major component of this. And then third, I'm also teasing out, I didn't think you said it directly, but I'm reading between the lines here, is, and this is where, all the technologies like blockchain come in, is the trust piece. It's,
Mm-hmm.
ensuring that if I purchase a vaccine, it's
Mm-hmm.
not, something that was artificially made by some third party that's trying to do something bad. That I know that I'm not supposed to inject myself with Lysol. That it's not FDA approved. Those sorts of things. Proving the authenticity of the supply chain. Did I get that right?
You got that right.
All right.
And that's why you and I work so well. You summarize so eloquently, and I ramble.
It's called active listening. You did all the hard work, and I just did the Cliff Note version. So what's required here? So we talk about technologies like blockchain, but
Mhm.
in your mind, we need an infrastructure for something like
Right.
this.
Mhm.
Have you been thinking about that? And if so, what does that look like?
This goes back to, that's a great question. This goes back to blockchain in of itself is not going to, solve world hunger and save the dolphins. It could definitely give you safe drugs, which is what you just said, but only when it's what we're calling digital trust infrastructure. Basically, enabling trust at the time of product creation, at the time the product is shipped, at the time anything that births the product, anything that births the data. So at the time of from an information lifecycle management, if you fundamentally think about it, forget the technology again. There's three parts of information, right? There's creation, curation, consumption, right?
Hmm.
And so if you can encrypt data, that's great. But anything that can be encrypted can always be decrypted, right? And that's where the fundamental mind shift is with blockchain, because in a private permission with a public infrastructure, and this is a little complex to understand, but Bitcoin is the largest public blockchain infrastructure. But the work that we're doing with the FDA is a private blockchain with only permission access to certain actors we know and trust. But then because we trust the actors, we now inherently capture that trust digitally. That capability didn't exist hitherto until now.
So real quick,
And
Arun,
so,
just so people, because
yeah,
this is a sticking point for a lot of folks
yeah.
when they're new to the technology, or have just been kind of skimming the headlines around blockchain, is the notion of a permission blockchain versus a permissionless blockchain. Maybe be
Hmm.
good to just kind of walk through in your mind what's the differences between the two. And you had mentioned this is a permissioned blockchain. So,
Hmm.
just so folks are very, very clear that we're not talking about crypto and, open
Right.
permissionless systems.
Right. And so, the very simply, a permission blockchain is something that is designed for certain parties to work within themselves. It's a closed network. That's why it's permission, because certain people have permissions. There's usually the concept of a trust anchor. So in the FDA pilot, say for example, the pharmaceutical manufacturer becomes the trust anchor, and they give out permissions. So basically, think of it as, going to a party, but you're screened at the door. Are you on the list or not? And if you're not on the list, you don't get in.
Yeah.
Right? And so, in the strictest form of ways, even though the bouncer is your dear friend. But there are certain rules and parameters that go into the private permission ecosystem. However, as you build the ecosystem, it will expand. As we're seeing this evolution of private systems become a little more quasi-public, because now you have 10 participants, 15 participants that are, each one has a node. And what I mean by that node is they have their own data, but they publish certain parts of the data to the rest of the blockchain, or the network.
Yeah.
And so that's how you build consensus. And so now that everybody agrees that the transaction took place, you record the transaction, right? And so that's the beauty of how this decentralized framework works. And then the permissionless, that is still working itself, but it is also one of the largest implementations of governance. What I mean by that is that everybody in a permissionless blockchain has the ability to interact, but also cryptographically sign each other's data pieces. That's a whole other conversation. But fundamentally, those are the key differences, where a private permission blockchain is something that innate, internal actors control with permission access, and permissionless is much more public infrastructure that anybody and everybody can get on.
Yeah. No, I think you described that really well, and I love the concept of the bouncer, because you can mentally visualize that, and so for the most tightly controlled blockchain solutions that may be just for one company, the bouncer is at the bedroom door. For a scenario where you've got a company that has a small set of its partners and one capability wants to open up, the bouncers in the front of the house.
Right?
As you start to increase the level of access and trust, maybe now the bouncer is at the edge of the community as you go into the gated community for all the homes, and then it goes on and on and on. And we could get philosophical real quick, but to some extent, there's always some level of permission, even in the permissionless world, right? It's not
Correct.
completely open. There is still some level of permission, but I think it's important for people to understand that you have to figure out from a business perspective
Right.
where the bouncer should be, based on, it could be security, it could be risk tolerance, It could be competitive advantage. Maybe you don't want to
Hmm.
share with other people, and maybe you have the ability to do that for a period of time. That's not for me or you to say, that's right or wrong, but that's a business strategy thing, right? And
Correct.
so placing that bouncer where it needs to be is a business question. And sometimes, and a lot of times with many of my customers and clients, I find that the bouncer is a bit of a journey. And so initially the bouncer starts in one place but ends up in another, right?
Yep. Yep. And that's the whole point of being the disruptor to yourself rather than waiting for somebody to disrupt you.
And so this digital trust infrastructure, um, you know, walk me through, what does that look like from a pharma perspective?
So the digital trust infrastructure is that you cut out there for a minute. Sorry.
Yeah, so
Yep.
walk me through the digital trust infrastructure. Like, what does the this value stream look like from the people that initiate the transactions to the folks at the other end
Mhm.
of the spectrum that are going to get the value uh, creation out of this?
So fundamentally, again, I go back to my favorite word of the day or the week or the month is convergence, right? And so whether it's a 2D barcode scanning or a temperature sensor, that is, go back to the three concepts of information: creation, curation, consumption. So the digital trust infrastructure essentially is designed to capture at source. It could be an IoT sensor, it could be a 2D barcode gun, it could be the label itself that goes on the vial of the product. That when you create the blockchain is born, the trusted auditability is born. So there's that whole sensor or data capture creation layer. Then you have the blockchain layer enough itself, which is now saying, okay, now I'm seeing a series of transactions, but I'm also going to use business logic to modulate. If it's like a traffic cop, a smart contract is nothing but a business rules engine
Hmm.
that sits and watches the blockchain in terms of saying if a product should go from this zip code to another zip code because that zip code has a COVID hot site, right? For example, I'm just giving you an example, right?
Yep.
And so the smart contract layer and the trust infrastructure is right there as the core of the ecosystem. And then on top, you have the different consumption models in terms of, 5 years ago it was reporting and analytics. Those are still important, but today it's about the signals repository. Today it's about sending those alpha beta signals to make decisions automatically using AI, right? Or, automatic is a bad word, but essentially automating the decision engine or decision sciences around it. And that's why, to us, the digital trust infrastructure of pharmaceuticals and the healthcare ecosystem is capture at source, sign it cryptographically, and moderate and modulate the process of business transactions there, which can connect to ERP, it connects to Hyperion, connects to any kind of enterprise system, because at the end of the day, they're still trusted sources for enterprise information.
Right.
And on the top is essentially your AI and machine learning and your distributed apps that drive the decision framework.
No, that
Does
makes
that help at a high level?
it does. It really does. And what it makes me think about is just a very simple scenario. So, and let me know if this matches what you're thinking here. So, let's say some drugs are created in the factory. They get
Mm-hmm.
popped into a pill bottle. They seal it. Do the things whatever they need to do. They put a label on there, and behind the label is a little sensor, and that sensor is going to track, for this case, maybe it's antibiotics, maybe it's penicillin
Mm-hmm.
that needs to be at a certain temperature. And so it's
Mm-hmm.
going to track the temperature. It's going to have a unique identifier for that prescription pill bottle. And so now I can now log that onto this digital trust infrastructure and say, okay,
Mm-hmm.
vial or pill bottle 1234 has been created, and now it's off, and it's going to go eventually to a pharmacy near you. But there's a lot of steps, a lot of hands it's got to go through to get there, and we need to make sure that those are trustworthy hands, those are the right hands, that as it goes
Mm-hmm.
from that manufacturer and gets put on a boat and gets shipped across an ocean, that
Mm-hmm.
it stays in a controlled temperature cabin. And if that sensor says, hey, you're out of compliance, it's going to put that on DTI, the digital trust infrastructure, and it's going to say, hey, our agreement here was it needs to be below 40 degrees, and it wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
So now
Mm-hmm.
that and all the other batches that are with that are now out of compliance, and we know, one, the drug is bad, but two, we know we're not going to pay this distributor, and they're in breach of a contract. We're going to know in real time if it wasn't their fault. Maybe it was faulty mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
The freon ran out. I don't know, but we're able to react in a much faster way. So, in those sorts of scenarios, are those the sort of scenarios that you're envisioning for DTI?
Absolutely. And temperature is one thing, but and this is again, I go back to my favorite counter argument. My technologies does it do it today, right? Why do I need digital trust?
Right?
The question is, what is that cost of trust? If your systems do it today, you're paying an inordinate amount of money to make sure that it's not only trusted, but my favorite phrase, trust but verify. That verification is 20 people across 20 phone lines, literally doing spreadsheets or emails to make sure that not only has the product moved, it was on the right container, on the right ship, at the right port, at the right time. Can you imagine the amount of data that needs automation in this whole journey? And that's why we believe the digital trust infrastructure is not just a pure automation engine. It leverages a significant amount of investments already being made by enterprises and networks or organizations that is not that big a leap. And going back to the FDA pilot, this is not a multi-million dollar endeavor. It's again taking taking the smart or working smart on using existing cloud technology and edge technology, and then moving it along to achieve your objectives in 3 months or less.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right, and that's a common question that's posed to me is so why can't we just use a database for this? Why can't we use all these existing tools? And the answer is you
Yeah.
can, you certainly can. But my question back to you is why haven't you already? Um,
Right.
is the question I pose back because yeah, I could probably do it in a database. I could do it in an Excel spreadsheet if I had one master shared spreadsheet that everyone could all add to and had the right access rights to. Sure, but the
Right.
challenge is that databases were not built for ecosystems. Databases were built for companies. And what we've done over the years is we've increased its footprint and its visibility by putting web services in front of it and other API layers to get access
Mhm.
to those databases. But the challenge is that databases were built for companies. Excel spreadsheets were built for people. Blockchain is built for many companies, an ecosystem. And while I could still use an Excel spreadsheet for an ecosystem, it doesn't have the native features that I need for an ecosystem. So to be able to have peer-to-peer interoperability by essentially saying, hey, you don't need a copy of SQL Server. All you need is a node that has everything built in. I don't
Mhm.
need to write my own custom web services because I've got smart contracts that handles all that right there at the edge. I don't have to have reconciliation processes because all the data cleansing happens at the point of entry into the blockchain, right? So there's all these great capabilities, whether it be the peer-to-peer data collaboration, whether to be data sovereignty, which is another aspect that we're kind of alluding to here, is that this is your data, and you have the ability to control your data and further permission that data. Lots of capabilities that are associated with this that I think people they don't recognize as the reasons why you should go down this path. So
Yeah.
so yeah, I just
And
officially
again,
went on my soapbox.
no, this is great. That's great. You captured it well.
So outside of blockchain, so we've been talking about blockchain a lot. So for DTI to be successful, what other technologies do you think need to play here to make this a viable solution for pharma companies?
So I think from a DTI perspective, the stack is built to integrate not just IoT and sensor data, but also transactional data. So having core enterprise software at the backbone of all of this is absolutely critical, but also the integration points into the network systems, right? When I say that if I'm the producer of the product, there's a distributor of the product and the dispenser, those back-end systems are super, super critical. But if when you step back and look at the converged play, is it's transaction systems, it's this trust infrastructure, but it's AI and ML. But from an AI ML perspective as well, it's data. At the end of the day, it's information, right? Is either you're looking at it or it's coming to you, right? Like an Instagram feed, right?
Yeah.
And so what we're trying to essentially do is humanize trusted data.
Mm-hmm.
And what we mean by that is not just putting it on your phone, but essentially helping you shape the journey of what your day in the life would be. If you're, in on the front lines, a healthcare worker that is looking at PPE supplies, or you're a physician trying to authorize off-label use of the product, you still need to know you trust the data.
Yeah.
And so from a business angle, that's how we pull it. But from a technology convergence angle, again, as we close but really meaningful shout to Azure because of how the stack shapes up, the platform as a service components is significantly advanced in terms of achieving that business vision. So, if you go into the Azure stack, there's almost every certain part of the platform components that we end up consuming in digital trust infrastructure.
Yeah, yeah, and what people don't realize about blockchain alone isn't all that sexy, right? It's a back end data technology. You don't ever really see it. But it's back there working for you. And I would say, and I'm probably being generous here, of even if a client says, "Hey, I want to build a blockchain solution," I would say that maybe 10%, maybe less of that solution is actually blockchain. The rest
Correct.
is data science. It's interoperability with those legacy systems that you had mentioned, because data doesn't like to play by itself. It likes to get around. It likes to be in the playground, right? Um, you have to have a user experience. So you've got to build on these technologies, and more and more, we want these trusted interfaces with trustworthy data. I look at blockchain as actually being really a more modern version of master data management. So if you've ever been on
And that's where it's becoming.
yeah,
That's where it's going.
so
You're
if you've
right.
ever been on an MDM project, I mean, these things are painful, right? I mean, I just have been involved in like product MDM and customer MDM, where customers you can only describe so many ways, but for whatever reason we've bastardized that a little bit. And product, again, it's we can make this as easy as or as hard as it can be, but those projects can be years to get off the ground. And so where blockchain is just in how it operates, with its ability to be not only immutable but also the dual ledger capability of hey, a verification of information across company borders. It's very, very powerful. And I think that can't be overstated enough, that just having that simple capability is vital to a lot of these companies.
Right? Oh, agreed. 100%.
So as we start to wind down here, so we talked a lot about the pharma space in particular. We talked about all the work that you guys have done in the FDA pilot, and where we see blockchain playing a major role. I guess for you, since this podcast is all about talking about the future and innovation, where do you see all this going? So we've been talking about where blockchain is right now. What's next? So what's the next blockchain? Or what's blockchain going to evolve into? How are companies going to use this in new and different ways? What's your theories here?
I think as you step back from the FDA pilot and some of the other engagements we've done, the ecosystem play is going to be super important. So the next year, we're going to build out supply networks. We're going to go build out distribution networks. Then that's just one part. From a core blockchain perspective, we have seen a significant rise in our crypto assets work, right? What I mean by that is essentially working with large exchanges, asset managers, wealth capital investors. And that has become a significant business for us, mostly not because, crypto assets is cool and again, it was always cool. And now, we're T minus 15 from the Bitcoin halving, which basically means for every 12 Bitcoin you could earn, you're now going to earn half. And so we're just at that precipice of valuation that's just going to go that way. It may not go, like a big major hockey stick, but it's going to continue to rise. And what that is giving is the evidence for regulatory reform, the evidence for changes in how payment structures will evolve. And we're seeing this convergence between crypto asset and digital payments being super accelerated in this post-COVID contactless world, if I can say that, right? And so, and because the crypto assets sort of genealogy lends itself very well to digital payments. And so, whether it's because at the end of the day, it's still a token, right? And so, and that's where the digital wallet infrastructure becomes so critical to achieving the next generation of payments. And so we're going to be very busy. We are busy in those sectors and doing those things. But beyond pharmaceuticals and back to healthcare, I think between vaccines, drug supply, and consumables, the trust infrastructure in the public sector is becoming significant investment because it's no longer the one or two companies doing trust anchors. It's now survive or unfortunately no don't survive has become a big issue in the post-COVID new reality. And so we're seeing a significant amount of, again, interest and investment from public agencies to say, how do we now create a statewide system that not only brings the state back to a state of reopening, but also doesn't shut us down should there be a second wave.
Right.
So I'll just leave you with those thoughts, and you and I can go on and on, but then we'd be past the listeners' patience. But anyway.
Yeah. So I've got two quick questions for you. First
Yes.
one is, for people that are, listening that may not be exposed to blockchain, or folks that have been exposed to blockchain and haven't had a great experience, what would be some of your recommendations to them on getting started on the right path? I mean, you and we've been doing this for a while. We've got some scars on our backs and lessons learned. What advice would you give to someone that is about ready to embark on something like a DTI-oriented initiative?
I would, basically, as the business problem, there's always business problems that executives are trying to solve, and the fundamental question is, never mind the technology. I come back to the two equations that help my clients anchor. What is the cost of trust to what you're trying to do? What is the value of trust that you're trying to build? And those are simple questions, but when you peel away, those are hard questions to answer. Whether it's a business transaction, whether it is a COVID passport solution, one of which we're working on, right? I can't because we're on NDA with another organization. I can't go into that, but it's fundamental to Microsoft's own ID 2020 framework, and each of those lend itself to the again question is what is the cost of trust in knowing who is COVID safe or not? Right? I'm just relaying to our times, but that's what our core to questioning those issues, and then saying, okay, now if I have a large ERP footprint and I'm going to upgrade the footprint with $20 million of capital spend, is that the smart play or is there a better way? And in conclusion, I go back to my favorite character on Disney Plus, The Mandalorian. We're realizing that this is the way.
Yep. No, I love it, and we're huge Star Wars fans here in this household, so those are going to resonate. Those quotes are going to resonate here. So, what I heard you say, as far as advice to people getting started, is one, know thy business. What are we here to do? What are we here to accomplish? And what is the most strategically relevant to our business? And if that was pre-COVID or post-COVID, it doesn't change the question. What is most relevant to our company? And now more than ever, it's we as technologists, we need to focus on how we can help organizations move forward through this crisis. But two, being able to map that to the unique capabilities that blockchain provides. Just like a database, you can misuse blockchain as well. And I'm sure you've seen your fair share of initiatives go south because blockchain wasn't the right solution. And
Yep.
there are many solutions where that does not make sense. And so,
Yep.
my advice to customers and to people beginning this journey is make sure you know and understand the unique properties and capabilities that blockchain provides, and make sure you can link that back to where your business needs to go. Third is partnerships, collaboration. As technologists,
Mm-hmm.
we sometimes fall into this kind of introverted category, and of being subject matter experts. But at the end of the day, we don't know it all, and especially on the business side, where many of these questions need to be answered first and foremost. It's about getting in front of this, and sometimes these business executives, and I can tell you firsthand, I'm sure Arun, you could tell folks firsthand as well, that oftentimes our business leaders are thinking quarter to quarter, maybe to the fiscal, maybe.
Yep.
So they don't have the luxury, not because they don't want to, but it's not their job to think past 3 months,
Mm-hmm.
4 months, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. That's our job to future proof the
Mm-hmm.
organization. So, in a lot of ways, they don't know what they don't know. And so, our job as well is to go back and use some creativity, some more open innovation type of thinking to essentially say, hey, I'm going to challenge the status quo here. What if we thought about our business in these oriented ways and we use these types of tools in our toolbox, blockchain and AI and IoT and many, many others that could be used to solve these problems?
That's right. Exactly right.
So,
It's a good summary.
so you talked about some cool stuff, Arun, and I'm sure people are excited about what you talked about and how it can help them. Last question for you is, how can people get in contact with you?
So it's simple. I'm on LinkedIn, pretty active. You know that. That's the usual way. I don't go on Twitter, mostly because of lots of little trolls that roam around Twitterverse. But LinkedIn is a good way, and then we have a public website. I can share the link with you, or my email, arunghosh at kpmg.com, arunghosh at KPMG, and I read every email. So,
Well, listen,
but I
Arun.
have a spam for you, Mike. Just kidding.
Ah, as you should, as you should.
On that note,
On that note, thank you, Arun, for joining us here. Very, very
absolute
insightful.
pleasure.
All right,
Thank
see you
you.
next time.
Thanks for having me. See ya.